It's very often in life that we doubt ourselves, that we think something is not possible, that we lead ourselves to believe that we're just not cut out for it, we're not capable. And many of the times this happens unconsciously. We've almost become so habituated to putting ourselves down and counting ourselves out that many times we don't even realize that's actually what's going on. We suffer from a lack of confidence, a lack of self-esteem, a lack of self-love and self-encouragement. And this is a problem, unfortunately, faced by many of us, right? I've yet to meet a person that hasn't, at one point or another, suffered from limiting beliefs. But until we actually talk about it and bring it to the surface and examine where this all comes from, right? Where does the lack of self-belief or where do limiting beliefs actually come from? It's very hard for us to actually address them. It's very hard for us to actually move past them and to live a life that is full of conviction, full of confidence, full of ease, and most importantly, full of fulfillment. This is a struggle that I've been dealing with pretty much for the latter half of my whole life. Not so much these days or in recent years, but I can vividly remember a huge chunk of my young adult years, starting from the early teenage years, leading up all the way to perhaps my late 20s, where this inundation of limiting beliefs was always a challenge, was always a threat. And it would often manifest itself in many different ways, right? So if there was, for example, a hobby that I would pick up, and maybe I aspire to take that hobby to its full length, right, or its full course. Let's say, for example, playing the guitar, something that I really enjoy doing, especially when I was younger. But as I kind of got more into it and as I enjoyed it, I started to develop these dreams of, doing something more than just playing for fun. And I had these sort of wild imaginations that perhaps I might become a guitar player or I might do something interesting with the guitar. But shortly after having these, fanciful ideas, I would kind of come crashing back down to earth and I would have these limiting beliefs. I would doubt myself. I would question whether I was even good at playing the guitar. And even though I would get outside encouragement from others, somehow I discounted that. And I would say to myself, oh, they're just being nice. Oh, they're just being polite. They don't actually want to say how bad I am. They don't want to crush my hopes. They don't want to crush my dreams. And so I just kind of fed myself these limiting beliefs, these false notions that somehow I'm not good enough. And of course, that's a very um, innocuous example, right? That it's not, I'm not crushed today that I didn't become this world-class guitarist, but there are other examples where it did take a toll on me personally. It did affect me mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and it took a long time for me to kind of come back full circle and to see those limiting beliefs for what they truly are, which are nothing more than an illusion, nothing more than a mirage, nothing more than an idea we have created and believed this whole time. You see, sometimes it's easy for us to attribute these limiting beliefs to factors beyond us, right? If you are someone that has suffered from bullying, for example, and you might feel victimized or under attack, it's very easy to then say, well, this person caused that, right? And I've suffered emotional trauma or physical trauma, mental trauma because of this person. And there may be an element of truth to that, right? I'm not trying to deny the fact that bullying often involves a subject, right, causing the bullying. But then there's also an element of how you respond to that, right? How do you internalize that? And of course, with something as devastating as bullying, it's hard to sometimes take the rational view, take the objective view or the detached view, and to kind of see ourselves not as the victim of bullying, but rather as an experiencer of bullying. That we are, in essence, somehow greater than just this body or this mind that is being under attack. Now, again, this is hard for us to realize in the moment, which is why a lot of what I'm going to be sharing in this video is meant for you to then go back and reflect on these things. Reflect on the areas of your life where you feel like you have been under pressure externally, but then therefore went one level beyond that and made sort of a narrative out of that. Started to find reasons perhaps for why you were bullied, and thereby feeding this vicious cycle of, well, I have these flaws or I have these attributes, and therefore I'm the target of bullying. And you create all these limiting beliefs. I'm not good enough. I look different. I talk different. I can never be accepted, right? You see how easy it is for us to kind of get down this dark path. And for many of us, unfortunately, it's something that we carry with us, right? We carry this emotional baggage. And it's very easy for us to watch months, if not years of our life go by, and we still find ourselves bearing the same burdens. We never really address them. We never really move past them. And in many respects, that limits our ability to experience life to its fullest, right? If you have emotional baggage or trauma that you haven't resolved up until this point, that is preventing you from seeing the deeper meaning and the deeper truth of your existence. That is preventing you from experiencing true and unconditional bliss, the true inner peace that many talk about, but very few people actually achieve because they are also themselves the victims of limiting beliefs, right? You look outside today, there's no shortage of people who exude a sense of self-confidence and exude a sense of control and coolness and kind of this inflated sense of self, but this is all just a defense mechanism, detracting away and reflecting away all the inner work that is necessary to truly heal and to address those problems. All right, so this is a very deep and, without trying to get philosophical here, right? Because all my videos, I always try to approach it with the intent of how do we make it practical? How do we actually work on it? How do we actually take the lessons or the teachings or the insights being spoken or shared and apply them to our life to instill real and valuable change, right? And this is, I think, one area where we can all relate to, right? We all have limiting beliefs to various levels, to various degrees, but we've all had this sort of notion. And even the most confident person or the person who externally exudes that confidence, even they can sometimes struggle with limiting beliefs. And that false sense of confidence is sort of a defense mechanism covering what's really going on beneath the surface. It's a shame, really, because I think if we all were given the tools and given the space and given the love and encouragement to actually explore some of this baggage that we carry, then we can actually approach it the right way, right? What I'm trying to say is there's nothing wrong with having limiting beliefs, but there is something wrong with denying that we have limiting beliefs. There is something wrong with trying to brush it under the rug, with trying to ignore it, with trying to hope and wish that it goes away, or just flat out not even realizing that they are there in the first place. That is a life that is not truly fulfilled. That is an unconscious life, a life surrounded and overwhelmed with unconsciousness. And of course, many people can live that life, right? It's not that all of a sudden you can't eat or sleep or carry out, the basic functions of living. But there's a very, you know, night and day difference between just living and actually fulfilling what you were meant here to do, right? It's heaven and earth. One is simply breathing, and one is experiencing, experiencing this spiritual being in human form. So I don't want to dwell on, the folks that maybe are not focusing on it. I want to maybe spend some time focusing on how you can devote more time and attention and awareness to, number one, noticing these limiting beliefs, but number two, hopefully then putting into motion the steps and the behaviors needed to ultimately grow from these limiting beliefs, to ultimately call them out for what they really are. Now, in order to notice our limiting beliefs, we have to first acknowledge that perhaps we are not the center of the universe, that perhaps we don't know everything, that perhaps we are not even this mind that we think we are, right? And this is a very radical notion to many of us, right? Because as much as we've experienced and traversed the physical realm, it's something much, much, much scarier to traverse and navigate the inner realm, the spiritual realm, right? You can write a ton of books on spirituality, but if you don't actually experience spirituality, that's a totally different thing. If you don't do the inner work, if you don't confront what has held you back and what has contributed to some of the traumas that you were experiencing, and you haven't really grown or learned anything from it, then you know you're just kind of living life from an intellectual standpoint, from a mind standpoint, but you're not actually experiencing the core essence of life. So I think, you know, we all have this opportunity, myself especially, to take a step back and to say, to examine all of our behaviors, right? It's very hard to do this in real time, or at least I don't suggest starting that way. But when you do have, when you're able to create some space and some time in your life, kind of reflect on just what transpired throughout that day. Were there certain behaviors or things that you did that maybe you would have done differently? Or perhaps you could have exhibited more love, kindness, and generosity. As I say this, I actually reflect on a conversation earlier I had with one of my tax preparers, and I was even noticing during the conversation too, because he, it seemed like he was new, and so he wasn't as familiar with some of the different tax strategies that I was talking about, and I noticed myself kind of getting a little bit frustrated, right? And I was trying my best to kind of reel it all in, but I asked for his manager or his supervisor because I wanted to speak with someone who knew kind of what I was talking about and was interested in learning more. But after he handed it over and I got the whole issue resolved, I sort of reflected and thought to myself, why did I act this way? Why was I impatient with him? Yes, these are not some things, things that happen on a daily basis. So even someone that does prepare tax returns for a living, they may not be able to catch all these things. But I think in that moment, I kind of got under the control of my ego, and I felt that, well, geez, if I'm paying all this money for someone to prepare my taxes, I would expect them to at least know how to do it. So there's this kind of I wouldn't say it's a limiting belief, but it is certainly this notion that I should be treated a certain way, and that by not treating me a certain way, then this person's attacking my best interests or is not in aligned with my best interests. And if I dig a little bit further, maybe I can get to the crux of the issue, which is a fear of not being understood, a fear of not being acknowledged. And where does this fear come from? It comes from years, starting from the early moments, perhaps in my childhood, but even more so during my teenage years, of this feeling, kind of this root that has taken life and has sprung into something of not being understood, not being appreciated, and not feeling whole, not feeling protected, not feeling loved. So you see how something as simple and seemingly innocuous as trying to make sure your taxes are prepared in the right way can unveil and reveal so much more beneath the surface, right? And this is just one example. As you all know, I'm always happy to kind of pick on myself and highlight and shine light on the areas where I can learn and I can grow. But I hope by doing so, it's not just an entertaining exercise, but also kind of it gets you to think about what are some of those same experiences, right? Your interactions with others, for example, your activities, right? I brought up the example of the guitar earlier. Like, are there areas of your life where you're doubting yourself, where you feel like you're lacking self-esteem, right? Whether that's about your physical appearance, whether that's about your capabilities, whether that's about whether or not people love you and support you, and whether or not your contributions and your presence and your identity is valued by members of society. These are all wonderful windows and gateways to discovering those limiting beliefs. And the beautiful part is that just by the very nature of becoming aware of those beliefs, you already begin the process of eliminating them, or at the very least, not letting them control and have a grasp on your life, right? Perhaps had I done a little bit more reflection, had I been a little bit more connected, I would have had perhaps some more patience and some more compassion with, my tax preparer today. And so that's a lesson for me to work on, right? We're never truly perfect. Life is this beautiful lesson that's never fully finished. But I definitely do know that I could have handled it better. And certainly the next time that I get on the phone and I feel like someone's not really understanding what I'm saying, then I want to make sure that I remember these words and that I live by them, and that I, number one, assure myself that it's okay, right? I feel whole and complete whether or not someone understands me or whether or not I perceive, because a lot of this is perception too. There's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings that can develop along the way. And that's a challenging thing when it comes to dealing with others, because sometimes they may not have intended any sort of attack or insult or inconvenience, but that's unfortunately how we perceive them. And a lot of that is shaped by our own views and beliefs and opinions. So, to really kind of bring it back to this main theme of identifying limiting beliefs, see what areas of your life, whether it's things that happened today or things that happened years ago, right? There's never, life is, I forgot who said this quote, but life is lived forward but understood backwards, right? If you think about it, you can never truly learn from the future because it hasn't happened yet, right? You can only learn from what has passed. And for those of us who have great memories, you're able to really tap into years of experiences, of moments, of events, of conversations, of relationships, and really bring that all back on the table, right? Just because it's in the past, just because it's happened, doesn't mean that your lesson or your education or your growth is done. Bring those back to the surface, even if it's uncomfortable, right? Even if it's an extremely traumatic or difficult or incredibly insufferable experience. You're only doing yourself a disservice by kind of ignoring it and hoping it goes away. Let those experiences, let those moments be your teachers so that you can truly face your limiting beliefs and finally let go of the shackles. As Rumi says, you have the prison door is wide open and you have the key. So we're the ones that put the limiting beliefs in the first place. But the good news is that we are the ones that can also remove those limiting beliefs, right? If we in our core do not believe in ourselves, then no amount of encouragement, no amount of support of any kind from anyone will be able to help us move forward, right? So it starts with us. We are the masters of our own destruction, but we are also the saviors of our own demise. We are also the ones that can help us. When we really think about it, it's kind of like this image of falling down, but then someone else is reaching their hand out to pull us back up. And we don't realize it, but that person is our future self, our wiser self, our more aware self that has had more time on this earth, that has experienced more, that has hopefully grown more, and they're more compassionate to our younger and immature and more fragile and incomplete self. So life is just this beautiful unveiling of falling down and then a wiser version of ourselves picking us up again. And then, of course, when that wiser self falls down, an even wiser version will come and pick up that person or that self. So we go through these iterations, we go through these different metamorphoses. It's not that we just, become start as the caterpillar and then become the butterfly. There's constant change always happening. We change from a butterfly to something even more beautiful, and from there, even more beautiful, until ultimately we realize that we're not all these shapes and forms. We're not this physical creature that is the shape of a caterpillar or the shape of a butterfly, but we are really the essence that runs through all of it. That's kind of how I ultimately see it. That to me is really the crux of awakening, is to see through all these different versions of ourselves and to see the one uniting and common thread among all. And why each version, each snapshot of ourself is so critical to the entire experience of human life, right? You may look back at a previous version of yourself with disappointment, with anger, with judgment. But believe me, that version of yourself, even if it was prone to mistakes, even if it did things you're not proud of, even if it was incredibly damaged and full of flaws, believe me, there's a beauty to that version of yourself too, because it led to your growth today. And one cannot truly grow, one cannot truly rise if they don't fall down first. We have to experience one thing in order to appreciate and enact the other. So I'll leave you with that. I know the conversation has definitely bounced around a lot, and I hope I was able to kind of keep your attention, because I do believe this is such an important topic, right? If we have all these limiting beliefs, we can never truly advance in life. We can never truly live from our core, live from our authentic being, and connect with God, connect with our Creator, connect with our purpose in life. So I hope you found this video instructive and informative and hopefully inspirational to some degree. to know that it is possible to shatter that glass ceiling and to move beyond your limiting beliefs. Because you are, in essence, a reflection of the divine. And of course, God does not doubt himself. God can do anything, God is everything. And so, if you can start to align yourself with this notion of invincibility, of immortality, of endless growth and endless awakening and endless being, well, then all of a sudden your life will take on a whole new trajectory.